In the pre-dawn dark of the Colorado high country 1877, two cabins sat braced against the crushing cold. Inside the first, belonging to Elias Thorne, a thin metallic roar filled the air. His pride of St. Louis lightweight box stove, 1 4-inch plate iron, glowed a dull, angry cherry red. It consumed seasoned pine with a frantic hunger, throwing off an intense, scorching heat that made the area 5 feet around it unbearable, while the cabin's corners, barely 12 feet away, remained cold enough to freeze water. Thorne, a recent arrival from the east, had been up since 3 a.m., just as he had been at 1 a.m. The stove, which he had paid a full $18 for, devoured his meticulously split wood in less than 3 hours, leaving his family to shiver in the dark as the temperature plummeted from 80 degrees to 35 degrees before he woke, cursing, to feed the beast again. Half a mile down the creek, Silas Vane's cabin was silent. There was no roar, only the faintest whispering hiss from his stove, an old, heavy, pot-bellied Franklinton model he had salvaged from an abandoned freight wagon. The air inside was not hot, but it was warm, a steady, even 62 degrees Celsius. Vane had not touched his fire since 9 p.m. the previous evening. He slept soundly, secure in the knowledge that his stove, holding a single massive log, would still be radiating warmth when the sun finally broke the ridge. Thorne was following the written advice of every stove manufacturer and settlement guide. Vane was following a different kind of wisdom, one that defied the modern logic of the 1870s. What did this quiet mountain man understand about the physics of heat and combustion that the engineers and settlers had completely, dangerously missed? The year was 1877, and the push west was relentless. The railroads had carved arteries through the wilderness, and settlers followed, bringing with them the tools and beliefs of the settled, humid East. They were arriving in the high valleys of the Rockies, a land that was beautiful but fundamentally alien and unforgiving. The winters here were not the damp 30-degree winters of New England. They were dry, wind-scoured and absolute. Temperatures of 20 degrees were common, 40 degrees was expected. Survival was not a given. The primary tool for this survival, the very heart of the homestead, was the wood stove. By the 1870s, cast-iron technology had advanced. The new mail-order stoves were lighter, cheaper to ship, and designed for efficiency. The manuals and conventional wisdom, printed in pamphlets from Chicago and St. Louis, were explicit. For maximum heating effect, use only well-seasoned dry wood, split to a uniform small size. This hot and fast approach was the accepted science. A roaring fire meant warmth. A stove that could get red-hot quickly was seen as a sign of quality. This doctrine was repeated by land agents, sold by hardware merchants, and practiced by nearly every settler, including Elias Thorne. They built their standard single-wall log cabins, chinked them with mud and straw, and bought the shiniest, most modern stoves they could afford, trusting implicitly in the wisdom of the manufacturers. The conventional method was about brute force. Overwhelm the cold with a massive rapid release of thermal energy. It was a strategy of open battle with the cold. Silas Vane, however, wasn't interested in a battle. He was interested in a truce. Elias Thorne's cabin was a case study in this conventional failure. It was a respectable 16 by 20-foot structure built from lodgepole pine he had felled himself. He had followed the pamphlet instructions perfectly. His Pride of St. Louis stove was centrally located, its stovepipe running straight up. He spent 3 months of the fall cutting and splitting, building a woodpile of seasoned aspen and pine that dwarfed his cabin. Yet he was always cold and always working. The stove itself was the problem. Made of 1 4-inch thick iron plate, it had minimal thermal mass. The moment the fire died down, the stove was cold. To keep it hot, it needed a massive draft and a constant supply of fuel. Thorne kept his flue damper wide open, just as he would an open fireplace, believing this drew the fire. In reality, it was drawing 90% of his heat straight up the chimney. His fuel consumption was staggering. 5 cords of wood per week, an amount that would see his entire autumn's work vaporized by February. The quality of the heat was terrible. It was a dry, scorching blast. The air in his cabin was baked, causing the wood of the structure to shrink and crack, opening new gaps for the 22D air to infiltrate. His wife, Mary, suffered from a constant cough, her lungs irritated by the alternating blasts of superheated dry air and Arctic cold. At 2 a.m., on a typical Tuesday in January, the internal temperature of Thorne's cabin would drop from 75 degrees at 11 p.m., when he last loaded the stove, to 28 degrees. The water bucket, 10 feet from the stove, was a solid block of ice by morning. Thorne was doing everything right according to the book, and it was killing him. Silas Vane's knowledge had not come from a book. He had come west in the 1850s, long before the railroad, as a trapper for the American Fur Company. He had wintered in the Wind River Range, the Bitterroots, and the high Uintas. His first winters had been brutal lessons in survival, taught by the failure of his civilized gear. He learned by watching. He watched the Ute and the Arapaho, who survived the same winters not in drafty log cabins, but often in hide lodges or even snow-covered wickiups. Their fires were never the roaring bonfires of the settlers. They were small, contained, and managed with scientific precision. They used the coals, not the flame. He also spent 2 winters trapped with an old French-Canadian coureur des bois who taught him the old-world method of the bûche de Noël. Not the festive log, but a massive single log of green wood placed at the back of a hearth, which would smoulder and radiate heat for an entire night, even in an open fireplace. Vane combined these observations. He learned that seasoned wood, the best wood, burned too fast. It was for cooking, or for a quick warming, not for sustained survival. He learned that mass held heat, whether it was a soapstone hearth or a thick-walled stove. He learned that air was the fuel, just as much as the wood. Control the air, you control the fire. When he finally built his own homestead, settlers like Thorne, new to the valley, watched him. They saw him drag massive 20-inch diameter rounds back to his cabin, logs he'd felled 6 months prior, not 2 years. They watched him spend more time chinking his cabin with moss and clay than he spent splitting wood. "He's lazy," Thorne had remarked to the land agent. "Too lazy to split his wood proper. That's squaw work, hauling rounds like that." Silas heard them. He just kept working, confident in the physics he had learned in the hardest school on earth. Silas's first implementation of his system was his cabin itself. It was smaller than Thorne's, only 14 by 14 feet, and crucially, it was built into a south-facing hillside. The north, east, and west walls were bermed with earth up to 3 feet high, using the planet itself as insulation and a windbreak. The front was traditional log, but the chinking was a meticulous mixture of clay, sand, and dried moss, driven so tight it was plastic. His stove was the Franklinton, a relic, but one he chose specifically. Its walls were 3 8-inch thick cast iron, twice the thickness of Thorne's stove. It weighed over 300 pounds, a dense battery for thermal energy. But the true innovation was the operation, a ritual he performed every night at 9 p.m. First, he used a small, hot fire of split aspen to cook his supper and heat the cabin to about 68 degrees. As this fire burned down, he scraped the glowing red-hot coals into a dense pile at the front of the stove's firebox. Then, he brought in the log. It was a 24-inch long, 18-inch diameter round of dense spruce. It was not fully seasoned. He had tested this. A log dried for 2 years would ignite too quickly. This log, cut the previous spring, had a moisture content of around 30% in its core. It was heavy, and it hissed when it got near the coals. He manhandled this king log into the stove, pushing it back against the hot coals. He then banked the front and sides of the log with ash, creating an insulating barrier. The only parts exposed to the coals were the back and underside. Finally, and this was the critical step, he closed the flue damper on the stovepipe until it was 90% shut, just a crack remaining. He then closed the stove's own air inlet vent, adjusting a small slider until the opening was no larger than a silver dime. The stove did not roar. The fire did not flare. Instead, the king log began to cook. The conflict between Silas Vane and Elias Thorne was a conflict of philosophies, a battle of brute force versus intelligent control. Thorne, representing the conventional wisdom of the day, operated on the brute force model. This philosophy dictated that to create heat, you needed three things in abundance: dry fuel, oxygen, and ignition. His goal was rapid, high-temperature combustion. He wanted a visible, roaring fire, believing that the flames themselves were the source of the heat. He was, in essence, running an open hearth inside an iron box. He was burning his fuel in a sprint, generating a massive surplus of heat, 80 degrees and 90 degrees for a short period, most of which was lost up the chimney, followed by a long refractory period, where the cabin became dangerously cold, 30 degrees Celsius, 40 degrees. His life was a cycle of peaks and valleys, a slave to the stove's 3-hour appetite. Silas Vane operated on the energy management model. He saw his stove not as a fireplace, but as a sealed system gas generator, or more accurately, a charcoal retort. He understood a core principle of physics. The energy in the wood is fixed. The only variable is the rate at which you release it. He did not want a flame, he wanted a smolder. By laying a massive, partially green log and banking it with ash, he was insulating it. By starving it of air, damping the flue and the vent, he prevented combustion. The hot coals initiated a process called pyrolysis. The log wasn't burning, it was baking. The intense oxygen-starved heat was breaking down the wood fibers, driving out the moisture as steam and, crucially, cooking the wood into flammable gases, wood gas or syngas. This gas, mixed with the tiny wisp of air he allowed in, would ignite in a small, steady blue flame at the top of the stove. He was turning a single-stage stove into a 2-stage gasifier. The log itself became a massive piece of charcoal, glowing a dull red, radiating a steady, low-level, consistent heat for hours. Thorne was trying to heat his cabin with fire. Silas was heating his with physics. The arrival of Mr. Abernathy, a land agent for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, provided the first objective data. Abernathy was not a frontiersman. He was an engineer from Chicago, tasked with evaluating the viability of these new settlements. He carried a leather satchel containing a ledger, a barometer, and a calibrated mercury thermometer. He was a man who believed in numbers, not folklore. He first visited Elias Thorne, as Thorne was the most civilized and vocal of the settlers. Abernathy recorded the data in his ledger. 7 p.m., stove fully loaded. Cabin interior 78 degrees. 7:45 p.m., stove requires fuel. 10:15 p.m., stove requires fuel. Exterior temp 12 degrees. Abernathy, wrapping his coat tighter, noted that Thorne's wood consumption was unsustainable, calculating it at over 1.25 cords per week. The next day, he visited Silas Vane. He was skeptical of the quiet man and his earth-burned cabin. He entered. The air was pleasant. His thermometer registered 61 degrees at 12. The stove was warm but not hot. Abernathy noted the king log method with suspicion. "Seems primitive," he wrote, but he was a man of data. He left his thermometer. He returned at 7 a.m. the next morning, after a night where the temperature had dropped to 18 degrees Celsius. He braced himself as he opened the door, expecting an icebox. The cabin was 59 degrees. Vane was sitting at his table drinking coffee. The stove had not been touched. The king log, now a massive block of glowing char, was still radiating heat. Abernathy checked his thermometer, tapped it, and checked it again. He looked at Silas's woodpile, small, neat, with a stack of large rounds set aside. His notes were stark. Vane system, 14-hour thermal consistency, fuel consumption estimated at 0.25 cord per week. This is a 500% efficiency gain over the standard method. The engineer from Chicago was baffled and intrigued. Let us open Silas Vane's system and examine its components, for it was a system of layers, much like the man's own winter clothing. The first layer was the foundation, the earth-bermed cabin. By building into the hillside, Vane had eliminated 75% of the cabin's wind exposure and leveraged the Earth's stable 50-degree temperature as a massive thermal sink, or rather, a thermal insulator. The second layer was the stove itself, not a thin, efficient plate stove, but a 300-pound beast of 3 to 8-inch thick cast iron. This heavy mass was a heat battery. It absorbed the energy from the slow smolder and radiated it back into the room steadily, smoothing out the peaks and valleys that plagued Thorn. The third layer was the fuel, the king log. This was the genius of the system. The log's size, 18 to 20-inch diameter, meant it had a very low surface area to mass ratio. It was difficult to ignite. The 30% moisture content was a feature, acting as a thermochemical break. To burn, the heat first had to drive off this moisture, converting water to steam. This process is incredibly energy-intensive, the latent heat of vaporization, effectively cooling the log and preventing it from bursting into flame. It forced a slow burn. The fourth layer was the operation, pyrolysis. By banking the log with ash, a superb insulator, and starving the air, Silas was creating a charcoal retort. The log was decomposing into wood gas. This gas, hotter and lighter, would rise to the top of the firebox. The fifth layer was the secondary combustion. The tiny wisp of air allowed in through the dime-sized vent was not for the log, it was for the gas. This preheated air mixed with the wood gas at the top of the stove and burned in a small, clean, incredibly efficient blue flame. Silas was harvesting all the energy, the radiant heat from the glowing char log, stage 1, and the chemical energy from the burning gas, stage 2. This was a two-stage burn in a single-stage stove, decades before the technology was invented. The true test came in January of 1878. The settlers would later call it the Great Scourge. A high-pressure system parked over the Arctic and pumped a river of pure polar air into the Rockies. The temperature fell, and it did not stop. For 5 straight days, the thermometer never rose above 30 degrees Celsius, 34 degrees Celsius. The wind blew at a steady 40 mph, driving the wind chill to a level that was not just painful, but lethal, capable of freezing exposed flesh in under a minute. This was the event that broke settlements. At the Thorn cabin, the brute force method failed catastrophically. The pride of St. Louis stove, roaring 24/7, was a beacon of heat loss. The 1 4-inch iron could not hold the heat against the 30-degree Celsius air, and the massive draft of its open damper was actively sucking the warm air from the cabin. Thorn was burning wood at a rate of 1 cord every 2 days. By day 3, he had burned through all his split wood. He was desperate. He tried to split more, but the cold was so intense the steel of his axe was brittle and chipped. He began burning fence posts, then his spare wagon wheel, then a chair. The temperature inside his cabin, despite the raging fire, was 20 degrees Celsius. His wife and child were huddled under every blanket, their breath frosting in the air. On day 4, Thorn made a frantic run to his woodpile for a log he'd missed and suffered severe frostbite, his hands turning a waxy dead white. He was losing. In Silas Vane's earth-bermed cabin, the world was still. The wind howled over him, not at him. The steady 50 degrees Celsius of the earth was insulating his walls. Inside, the Franklinton stove was performing exactly as it was designed. At 9 p.m. on the first night, Silas had loaded a massive 22-inch king log of pitchy pine. He damped it down. The stove's thick walls radiated a steady 60 degrees Celsius into the small space. He slept. He woke at 7 a.m. The cabin was 58 degrees. The log was half consumed. He opened the dampers for 30 minutes, made coffee on the now hot stovetop, and added a smaller day log. He then damped the system back down. He was not surviving. He was living. He had enough king logs to last 3 weeks. On the 5th day, the wind died, though the cold held. Mr. Abernathy, who had been holed up in the settlement's draughty hotel, a large single-wall barn, saw the thin, steady wisp of smoke from Vane's chimney. He saw no smoke from Thorn's. Fearing a tragedy, he and 2 other men fought their way through the chest-deep drifts. They found the Thorn cabin. It was an icebox. The fire was dead. Thorn and his wife were barely conscious, their breathing shallow. The internal temperature was 15 degrees Taum. Thorn's hands were black and swollen. They were hours from death. The men carried them, wrapped in their own coats, the half-mile to Silas Vane's cabin. The transition was shocking. They fell from a 30-degree world of howling wind and blue-white ice into a space of 60 degrees, still air, and the smell of coffee. The warmth was so sudden, so total, that Mary Thorn began to weep uncontrollably. Silas, without a word, tended to Thorn's hands, his face grim. He knew it was too late for the fingers. Now, his system was under stress. 4 adults, one of them critically injured. The door had been opened and closed, introducing a massive loss of heat. Silas adjusted. He did not feed the stove. He simply opened the air vent from a dime to a nickel. The rate of pyrolysis in the king log increased. The secondary flame brightened slightly. The heat output climbed from 60 degrees to 64 degrees, compensating for the extra bodies and the heat lost. He was not just an operator, he was a manager of a complex thermal system. He instructed Abernathy, keep the door shut, put a blanket over the opening. He was maintaining the envelope. When the scourge finally broke, the settlement was transformed. Elias Thorn lived, but he would never hold an axe the same way again, losing 3 fingers on his right hand and 2 on his left. He had paid the price for his trust in conventional wisdom, but he was a changed man. The first thing he did upon recovering was go to Silas Vane, holding out his bandaged hands, and ask, "Will you teach me to cut the king logs?" The data, however, was the most powerful agent of change. Mr. Abernathy's final report to the Denver and Rio Grande was not a simple land assessment. It was a technical treatise on frontier survival. Titled Comparative Analysis of Fuel Consumption and Thermal Retention in High-Altitude Dwellings, it contrasted the Thorn method, 1.5 cords, weak, system failure, 100% casualty rate, with the Vane system, 0.25 cord to tweak, 100% survivability at 30 degrees. The railroad, an entity that cared deeply about logistics and supply, saw the numbers. Vane's method meant a 500% reduction in the wood needed to supply their section gangs and station houses. The report was copied and circulated. Stove manufacturers in the East, seeing a new market, began to adapt. Within 5 years, new airtight stoves, boasting all-night burns, appeared in catalogues. They were heavy, thick-walled, and featured screw dampers for precise air control. They were, in effect, commercial copies of Silas Vane's Franklinton and his mountain-learned technique. Driving through that high valley in 1890, a little more than a decade later, you would see the legacy of Silas Vane written on the landscape. The cabins were built differently. Many were now L-shaped or dug into the hillsides. You saw sod roofs. The wood piles were the most obvious sign. Every cabin had 2, a large pile of split wood for cooking and a separate protected stack of massive 18 to 24-inch rounds, the king logs, curing for the long winter. Inside, the thin, flimsy Pride of St. Louis stoves were gone, replaced by 300-pound airtights and base burners. The knowledge had been assimilated. Elias Thorn, now the foreman at the supply depot, taught the new settlers himself, "Don't listen to what the catalogue says about a hot fire. You listen to what the mountain says. You want to survive? You don't fight the cold. You manage it." The wisdom of the mountain man had been codified. It was never about the stove itself, but the system. It was the realization that survival in an extreme environment is not a function of power, but of efficiency. It is not about how much heat you can make, but how much heat you can keep.